I lived in a quiet, nondescript neighborhood, a place where nothing ever happened, or at least that's what I used to think. A few months ago, my grandmother passed away, and I inherited her house, an old creaky Victorian at the end of a cul-de-sac. It was a beautiful, if slightly worn, relic from a different time. I didn't plan on moving in at first. I'd always thought of it as her place, and being there felt strange, like I was intruding. But after a few visits, the place started to grow on me, and I decided to move in for a while. The house was filled with the kind of silence that could either be comforting or unnerving, depending on your state of mind. During the day it felt peaceful, a quiet escape from the hustle of the city. At night, it was different. The darkness seemed to settle in the corners, thick and impenetrable. Every creak and groan of the old wooden floors seemed louder, as if the house was whispering secrets to itself. The first time I heard it, I was already in bed, half asleep. A faint, scratching noise from above. At first I thought it was a branch scraping against the roof, but when I listened more carefully, I realized it was coming from inside the house, somewhere just above my bedroom. The attic. I'd never been up there. I didn't even know what was stored in the attic, and frankly, I didn't care to find out. I brushed it off, convinced it was a mouse or some other critter that had found its way in. But the next night, it happened again. And then again the night after that. Every time the same quiet, deliberate scratching. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. An animal, maybe, or just the wind, stirring something loose. But something about it felt off. There was a rhythm to it, like someone scratching out a pattern on the other side of the ceiling. A few times I caught myself straining to hear, holding my breath, as if I could decipher some hidden message in the sound. But all it did was make my heart race. A week passed, and I was starting to lose sleep. Every night, the sound got a little louder, a little more persistent. By then I was no longer convinced it was an animal. It sounded too deliberate, too methodical, like someone was pacing back and forth just above my head, dragging their fingers along the wood. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared, really scared. I didn't tell anyone about it because, honestly, what was I supposed to say? I think there's something scratching around in my attic, and it's keeping me up at night. I knew how that would sound. One night, I finally reached my breaking point. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound clawing at my nerves when I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see what was up there, even if it was just to prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and made my way to the attic door. The house was dead silent, except for the sound of my footsteps, which seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. The attic door was old and heavy, and it creaked as I pushed it open. Stale air rushed out, thick with dust, as if the attic was exhaling after years of being sealed off. The narrow stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed up, and I had to force myself to keep going, even though every instinct was screaming at me to turn around and go back to bed. The attic was dark, and the beam of my flashlight barely cut through the gloom. It was filled with old furniture, boxes stacked haphazardly, and other forgotten relics covered in a thick layer of dust. But the scratching had stopped. The silence was suffocating, and every breath I took felt like it echoed in the still air. I shone the flashlight around, half expecting to see a raccoon or a bird nesting somewhere. But there was nothing, just shadows and dust. I was about to turn around, feeling foolish, when the beam of light caught something in the far corner of the room. A box, slightly open, with a few things spilling out. I don't know why it caught my attention. Maybe it was because everything else in the attic looked undisturbed, but this box, it looked like it had been moved recently. I walked over, my footsteps echoing in the silence, and knelt down in front of it. When I opened the lid, I felt a chill run down my spine. Inside the box were some of my things I hadn't even realized were missing. A pair of socks, a lighter I thought I'd lost, and a small pocket knife I kept in my bedside drawer. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it, when I noticed a piece of paper folded up at the bottom. I reached in and picked it up, my hands shaking. I unfolded the paper and shone the flashlight on it. The message was scrawled in a messy, jagged handwriting that made my blood run cold. I know you're here. I dropped the paper, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly the attic didn't feel empty anymore. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the darkness. I scrambled back, almost tripping over a stack of boxes, and ran down the stairs. I didn't stop until I was back in my room with the door locked behind me. That night, I barely slept. I kept expecting to hear footsteps coming down the stairs, or the doorknob turning as someone tried to get in, but the house was silent, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house changed. I didn't go back to the attic. I didn't even think about it. But the fear didn't go away. It was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. A few nights later, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, when I heard it again. The scratching, slow and deliberate, like someone was reminding me that they were still there, still watching. And that's when I realized it was never going to stop. Whoever, or whatever, was up there. They weren't just trying to scare me, they were waiting. It all started on a Tuesday. I got home from work, just like any other day. My wife was out of town for the week on a business trip, and I was looking forward to an evening of leftovers and mindless TV. But as I approached the front door, I noticed something odd. An envelope, plain white, with no return address and my name scrawled on it in unfamiliar, jagged handwriting. I hesitated before picking it up, feeling an unsettling chill run down my spine. The paper felt cold to the touch, colder than it should have been. I brushed it off. Maybe a neighbor was playing a prank. I tore it open and found a single piece of paper inside, folded neatly. When I unfolded it, I was greeted by a message, short and cryptic. "We're watching you." My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, scanning the street, the neighboring houses, but everything seemed normal. There was no one around, no hint of who could have left the note. I shook my head, laughing nervously. It had to be a joke, maybe a kid messing around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that crawled up my spine, like tiny ice-cold fingers. I tried to move on with my evening. I sat down on the couch, turned on the TV, and did my best to forget about the note. But as the night wore on, it stayed on my mind, like a shadow lurking in the corner of my thoughts. I found myself glancing out the window, peeking through the curtains, checking to see if anyone was out there. I felt silly, paranoid. But something about that note made me feel exposed, vulnerable. The next morning I found another envelope, same plain white paper, same jagged handwriting. This time there was no message inside. Instead, there was a Polaroid photo. It was of me, sitting on the couch, holding the first note, looking confused. I felt my breath hitch as I stared at the image, trying to process what I was seeing. The photo was taken from outside the living room window, sometime last night. Someone had been watching me, close enough to take a picture. I felt sick. This was no prank. This was real. Someone was out there, and they were watching me. I reported it to the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. "Could be a prank, sir. If it happens again, let us know." Their words did nothing to calm my nerves. The following days were a nightmare. Every morning, another envelope, another photo. They were getting closer, each one taken from a shorter distance. First it was from the sidewalk, then the driveway. The last one was taken from the front porch, so close that I could see the reflection of the camera flash on the window. I tried to keep my cool, but I was unraveling. I kept the curtains drawn, double-checked the locks, and barely slept. I told myself that the police would find out who was doing this. They had to. But things only got worse. The phone calls started. At first I didn't think much of them, just silent calls, nobody on the other end. But then I started hearing breathing, slow, deliberate, like they wanted me to know they were there. I'd hang up, my hands shaking, but the calls would start again, no matter what I did. I couldn't escape it. By Friday, I was a mess. I hadn't left the house since the second envelope, and I was barely sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see flashes of the photos, of those words, "We're watching you." I felt trapped, suffocated by the walls of my own home. I kept telling myself that if I could just make it through the weekend, my wife would be back, and maybe this whole thing would stop. That evening I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables was almost soothing, a brief moment of normalcy in the chaos. But then I heard it, a noise outside. It was faint, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the driveway. My heart began to pound. I turned off the stove, grabbed a kitchen knife, and crept to the window. In the dim light of the street lamp, I saw a figure hunched over by my car, their back turned to me. My breath caught in my throat. They were tampering with the tires, dragging something across the rubber. I wanted to scream, to run outside and confront them, but I was frozen in place, my hands trembling around the handle of the knife. The figure stood up slowly, almost leisurely, as if they knew I was watching. They turned, and I could make out the faintest hint of a smile beneath the shadow of their hood. Then, without a word, they reached into their pocket and pulled out another Polaroid, holding it up for me to see. Even from where I stood, I could see what it was. Another picture of me. But this time, it was different. I was asleep in bed, the photo taken from inside the room. I felt my stomach drop. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The figure took a step closer, still holding the photo up, almost as if taunting me. Then, they slowly placed it on the hood of the car, turned, and walked down the street, disappearing into the night. I called the police again, my voice shaking, and they finally took me seriously. They sent a patrol car to watch the house overnight, but by then, it didn't matter. I was already broken. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just sat there, staring at the front door, waiting for something to happen. By the time my wife came home, I was a wreck. She found me sitting on the couch, surrounded by crumpled photos and torn envelopes, and I could see the shock in her eyes. She tried to comfort me, to tell me everything would be okay, but I could tell she didn't believe it. A few nights later, we were woken up by a loud bang, like someone trying to break down the front door. We rushed to the living room, but there was nothing, just another envelope lying on the floor. This time there was no photo, no cryptic message, just one word, scrawled across the paper in that same jagged handwriting: "Run." And that's when I realized it wasn't just me they were after. They were watching both of us now. That Friday night was supposed to be a break from the usual routine. My parents were out of town, leaving me with the whole house to myself, a rare occurrence. At 16, this felt like freedom. No rules, no curfews, just me and a quiet house, where I could do whatever I wanted. I planned on staying up late, watching movies, and blasting music without anyone telling me to turn it down. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my room, I felt it. A chill ran down my spine. It was as if someone was watching me. At first I shrugged it off. Probably just the jitters, I thought. It was the first time I'd been left alone overnight, and maybe I was just spooking myself. But the feeling stuck, a prickling at the back of my neck, a sense of eyes on me. I tried to push it aside, turn my attention to my laptop, scrolling aimlessly through social media. But it was like I could feel something outside, beyond the screen. It was ridiculous. I knew that. But no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the unease persisted. I remember glancing up from my laptop, my eyes drifting to the window across the room. For just a second, I thought I saw something. A shadow moving in the backyard. It was barely a glimpse, just a flicker, like a shape standing just beyond the edge of the light. I blinked, squinting, trying to see through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the usual backyard, empty, still. My heart skipped a beat, and I tried to laugh it off. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. It gnawed at me, like a quiet whisper in the back of my head. Finally, I decided to close the curtains, drawing them tightly shut. Out of sight, out of mind, right? But it didn't work. If anything, the sensation of being watched only grew stronger. Every creak and groan of the house settling sounded louder, more menacing. I tried to distract myself, turning up the music, but even that didn't help. Every few minutes my eyes would flick to the curtains, half expecting to see a shadow pass by. It was late when I heard it. A noise outside, soft but distinct, a light tapping, like someone gently knocking on the window. My whole body tensed, every muscle frozen. I held my breath, listening, hoping I'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. Tap, tap, tap. I felt my pulse quicken, my skin prickling with fear. It had to be a branch, I told myself, probably just swaying in the wind. But the night was still. No breeze, no rustling leaves. I knew something was out there. I tried to ignore it, but I was on edge, my mind running wild with possibilities. After a few minutes, I forced myself to stand up, inching toward the window. My hand trembled as I reached out, fingers barely touching the curtain. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pulled it back in one swift motion. For a moment, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. There, just inches from the glass, was a face. Pale, hollow-eyed, with skin stretched tight over sharp bones. The eyes, dark, empty, and unblinking, were locked on mine, staring straight into me. Its breath fogged up the glass, just inches from where I stood, and I could see the outline of a thin, gaunt figure pressed against the window, barely visible in the dim light. I felt my heart stop, my stomach lurching as cold terror washed over me. I staggered back. A scream lodged in my throat, unable to move, unable to think. The figure just stood there, watching, not moving, not blinking. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. My fingers scrambled over the screen trying to dial for help, but before I could press call, I heard it. A loud crash, glass shattering. My head snapped up, and the window was empty. The figure was gone. Panic surged through me, pure blinding fear. I didn't know what to do, didn't know where to go. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, bolting for the door. I grabbed the handle, yanking it open, and stumbled out into the hallway, the darkness stretching out in front of me like a void. I could barely hear anything over the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. My eyes darted around, half expecting to see that face staring back at me from the shadows. I ran down the stairs, every step echoing, feeling like the house itself was closing in on me. My mind screamed at me to get out, to run, but I hesitated as I reached the front door. What if it was waiting for me outside? What if it was watching, just out of sight, ready to follow me if I stepped out into the open? I took a deep breath, trying to think, but there was no time. I could hear it, the faintest sound, like footsteps, moving somewhere behind me. I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed the door handle, my hand slick with sweat, and flung it open, bursting out into the night. The air was cold, sharp, biting into my skin as I ran, feet pounding against the pavement. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran and ran, not stopping until I reached my neighbor's house, banging on the door, desperate, breathless. When they opened the door, I must have looked insane, wild-eyed, shaking, barely able to speak. I tried to explain, to tell them what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come out right. They called the police, and when they arrived, they searched the house, checked the yard, but found nothing. No signs of anyone, no evidence that anything had happened at all. They told me it was probably just my imagination, maybe a bad dream. But I knew what I saw. I stayed at my neighbor's that night, too scared to go back home. I haven't been able to sleep since. Every noise, every shadow, a reminder of that face, those eyes. I keep telling myself it was a one-time thing, that whatever it was, it's gone. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and the house is dark, I still feel it. That same prickling sensation, like eyes on the back of my neck, watching, waiting.